Welcome back, everybody. Glad to be with you to jump back into Johnny Tremain, chapter 6. Just a little refresher of what we read in chapter 5 to set our foundation before chapter 6, as we learned a lot about Johnny and how he started to learn how to ride a horse. And then they have a horse at the Observer named Goblin, who's a little timid and easily scared, but Johnny and Goblin got along really well, and Johnny started to deliver the Observer to the different ends and places and different towns around. And that's kind of what we learned about. And so we're going to get into chapter 6. Remember, these chapters are kind of long, so if you need to take a break, pause the video, come back to it, or listen to it as you're getting ready for the day or eating lunch. That way you can stay on track and be able to not fall behind. On Sundays, the boys might relax a little. Breakfast, when they pleased, only they must turn up clean and shining in time to go to church with aunt and uncle and listen to the inflammatory Reverend Sam Cooper. Dr. Cooper was putting more politics than gospel into his sermons that fall, and more fear of taxation without representation than God into his congregation. And we were just learning about taxation without representation in history. So be able to make that connection right there. You guys should know what the Reverend Sam Cooper is talking about. England had, by the fall of 1773, gone far in adjusting the grievances of her American colonies, but she insisted upon a small tax on tea. Little money would be collected by this tax. It worked no hardship on the people's pocketbooks. Only 3 pence the pound. The stubborn colonists, who were insisting they would not be taxed unless they could vote for the men who taxed them, would hardly realize that the tax had been paid by the East India Company in London before the tea was shipped over here. After all, thought Parliament, the Americans were yokels and farmers, not political thinkers. And the East Indian tea, even after that tax was paid, would be better and cheaper than any the Americans ever had. Weren't the Americans, after all, human beings? Wouldn't they care more for their pocketbooks than their principles? Shivering, for the last week in November was bitterly cold. Johnny built up the fire in the attic. From the back window, he could see that the roofs of the Afric Queen were white with frost. A sharp rat-tat on the shop door below woke Rab. "What time is it?" he grumbled, as people do think they are disturbed too early Sunday morning. 7 past. I'll see what's up. It was Sam Adams himself. With either cold or excited, his palsy increased. His head and hands were shaking, but his strong, seamed face, which always looked cheerful, today looked radiant. Sam Adams was so pleased that Johnny, a little naively, thought he must have word that Parliament had backed down again. The expected tea ships had not sailed. "Look you, Johnny, I know it's Lord's Day, but there's a placard I must have printed and posted secretly tonight. The Sons of Liberty will take care of the posting, but Mr. Thorne must see to the printing. Could you run across and ask him to step over? And Rab, where's he?" Rab was coming down the ladder. "What's up?" said Rab sleepily. "The first of the tea ships, the Dartmouth, is entering the harbor. She'll be at Castle Island by nightfall." "So they dared send them?" "Yes." "And the first has come?" "Yes. God give us strength to resist. That tea cannot be allowed to land." When Johnny got back with Mr. Thorne, Rab had Mr. Adams' text in his hands, reading it as a printer reads, thinking first of spacing and capitals, not of the meaning. "I can set that in no time. 200 copies? They'll be fairly dry by nightfall." "Ah, Mr. Thorne," said Adams, shaking hands, "without you printers, the cause of liberty would be lost forever." "Without you," Mr. Thorne's voice shook with emotion, "there would not have been any belief in liberty to lose. I will, as always, do everything you wish." "I got word before dawn. It's the Dartmouth, and she will be as far as Castle Island by nightfall. If that tea is landed, if that tax is paid, everything is lost. The selectmen will meet all day today, and I am calling a mass meeting for tomorrow. This is the placard I will put up." He took it from Rab's hands and read, "Friends, brethren, countrymen, that worst of plagues, the detested tea, shipped for this port by the East Indian Company, is now arrived in the harbor. The hour of destruction, of manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny, stares you in the face. Every friend to his country, to himself, and to posterity, is now called upon to meet at Funeral Hall at 9 o'clock this day, that of course is tomorrow, Monday, at which time the bells will ring to make united and successful resistance to this last, worst, and most destructive Measure of Administration, Boston, November 29th, 1773. Then he said quietly, "Up to the last moment, up to the 11th hour, we will beg the governor's permission for the ship's return to London with their cargo. We have 20 days. Johnny knew that by law any cargo that was not unloaded within 20 days might be seized by the custom house and sold at auction. Mr. Lorne, needless to say, the observers will meet tonight. There are private decisions to be made before the mass meeting tomorrow at 9. Johnny pricked up his ears. Ever since he had come to Mr. Lorne's, and Rab said he might be trusted with anything, possibly with men's lives, he had now and then summoned the members of the Observers Club. They were so close to treason they kept no list of members. Rab made Johnny memorize the 22 names. They met in Rab and Johnny's attic. "Johnny," said Mr. Lorne, anxious and over-anxious to please Mr. Adams, "start right out." "No, sir, if you please. Noon will be better. That will give the members time to get home from church. And as usual, Johnny, make no stir. Simply say, 'Mr. So-and-so owes 8 shillings for his newspaper.'" Johnny nodded. That meant the meeting would be tonight at 8 o'clock. If he said £1 8 shillings, it would mean the next night at 8. £2, 3, and 6 would mean the day after at 3:30. It gave him a feeling of excitement and pleasure to be even on the fringes of great, secret, dangerous events. Today he could not make his rounds on horseback. A constable might stop him and ask embarrassing questions. There was a law against riding out on Sunday for either business or pleasure. The Reverend Samuel Cooper he dunned as he was shaking hands with his parishioners at the end of the service. He nodded as Johnny told him that 8 shillings were due on the paper, but a fashionable woman standing by said it was a fair scandal for boys to be intruding into God's house and dunning a clergyman, and if collecting bills wasn't work, was it? What was? She would call a constable and have the impertinent imp whipped for Sabbath breaking. Mr. Cooper had to cough so he could pretend not to be laughing, and he winked at Johnny in spite of the dignity of his black clericals, white bands, and great woolly wig. "I'll tell my brother William too, he offered. "Brother William and I will both pay you tonight." Johnny found 4 more of the members also at this meeting, and then headed for Beacon Hill. At all the great mansions he commonly went to the back door, either to leave newspapers or to collect bills. A skinny, slippery-looking old black slave in the kitchen told him Mr. Hancock was in bed with a headache. No, she would not permit Johnny to go to his bedchamber. So the boy went to the front door, rang the bell, hoping some other less obdurate servant might let him in. Maybe little Jehu. The old slave guessed what he was up to and got there first. Might he not send a note up to Mr. Hancock? They wrangled a little. At last she said yes, he might. She was preparing a catnip tea to send to the master. He would write a note and put it on the tray. In the kitchen he wrote his note. Mr. Hancock owes the Boston Observer 8 shillings. Folded it, and on the outside wrote, John Hancock, Esquire. Was it only 2 months before he had tried to write those very words and failed so miserably? The cook was squatting at the hearth, toasting the thin toast. Johnny lifted the teapot to set his note under it. That teapot, its handle was in the shape of a winged woman. Beside it was the creamer that he had loved so much. Even now he could shut his eyes and feel it in his hands. Ah, a sugar basin to match. Mr. Hancock had indeed found a smith to make it after Mr. Lapham failed so lamentably. Behind the cook's back, Johnny lifted it in trembling hands. The handles were wrong, done exactly as Johnny had started to do them before he talked with Mr. Revere. He thought with longing but contentment of the other basin, the one that had been exactly right and never completed. This one he held in his hands was nothing, trash, but how beautiful, how perfect, had been the other one. If I had to hurt my hand, I'm glad it was while doing something worthwhile, not merely mending an old spoon. The cook's wiry black fingers were in his hair. You no account? Don't you never think to go stealing sugar in this house? Mr. Hancock is that generous, I'd have given you a piece if you had asked, politely. Next to the Hancock house was the Lytes. Mr. Lyte, in his effort to play both ends against the middle, did take the Observer, and every Thursday Johnny habitually crossed from one stable yard to the other. There was no reason he should do so today, but it was as he told Cilla, he just about couldn't help watching the Lytes. What did they do on Sundays? Would that merchant be home today? He might have asked Captain Bull to dine with him. Would he see Miss Laphina, or only the fat cook, the scurly maids, Aunt Best, or the stableman? The cobbled stable yard was deserted. He did not hear the usual chatter from the kitchen. He glanced at the dining room window, the one Mr. Lyte thought he broke the night the cup was stolen. Doubtless now that cup Mr. Lyte had actually stolen from him stood with the other 3 on the sideboard. His jaw clenched. Sometime, someday, he would get it back, and not by snitching it either. A horse came clattering into the stable yard. Contrary to law and decent propriety, Miss Lavinia had been out for a gallop on the common. Her black horse was wet and foaming. The young woman sat her side saddle superbly. Her dark green London habit almost swept the ground. He knew that she had recognized him as the boy who had stolen the cup. The very first time she had met him delivering papers at her house, but she pretended not to. Now she glanced at him, and the chisel mark between the sweeping black brows deepened. "Williams?" she cried. "Bill Bear." There was no groom at the stable to help her dismount. The black horse reared. Johnny smiled. He knew enough about equitation to realize she was showing off. Johnny could make Goblin rear like that any time he pleased. It amused him that she pretended such contempt for him, and yet condescended to show off her skill before him. "Well, you then," she cried to him. With her nervous horse and long skirts, it was impossible for her to dismount from a side saddle without help. He gave her the help. She did not thank him. It was as if she knew that proximity to such famous beauty was rewarded enough for any boy or man in Boston. If anyone thanked, obviously it should be Johnny. He thought she was the most disagreeable woman he had ever seen, and yet the fact was he had slipped thus into the Lytes yard in the hope of seeing her, even risking Captain Bull and that threatened trip to Guadalupe. He liked to tell Rab how awful she was, and then would sneak back to take another look. Nearby was William Molyneux's house. Its seedy appearance advertised to the whole world that its owner was close to bankruptcy. Mr. Molyneux was standing in his orchard, shaking his cane at a couple of small boys he had treed in an apple tree. He had a terrible temper, which he thoroughly enjoyed. Although Johnny told him 3 times about those 8 shillings, he was not sure whether the idea had penetrated the wild Irishman's thick skull or not, nor did he care. His good friend Josiah Quincy, plump little John Adams, and James Otis he found together at the Quincy house. They were still sitting over their port and cracking nuts. James Otis did not even look up when Johnny entered. He was hunched up in his chair, his thick-skulled, heavy head hung forward. He was busy drawing a row of little people on the paper before him. Quincy, having already heard about the meeting that night, put a finger to his lips and shook his head. At the same time, glancing at the heavy, lonely figure of Otis, Johnny guessed that neither he nor John Adams wanted Otis notified of the meeting, although he was a member. For 4 years, Otis had been crazy and sane, turn and turn about, on again and off again. He was the most brilliant man of them all, thought in the largest terms, not ever merely of Boston, was passionate in his demand for the rights of Englishmen everywhere, over here and in old England too. Now he was not even listening to what was going on about him. His heavy head was swinging back and forth. John Adams and Josiah Quincy were watching him so intently, their heads were also moving a little. Johnny stole out and closed the door softly after him. He guessed that in a day or 2 he'd hear it whispered. James Otis had got into a mad freak and fired guns from the windows of his house. James Otis had been seen leaving Boston in a closed chaise with a doctor and in a straitjacket. Next he went to Dr. Church. Here was a queer man surely. He was still in his bedgown and slippers, with paper, inkhorn, and pens about him, writing poetry. Johnny did not care for Molyneux, because he bellowed and roared so loudly, but he disliked Dr. Church. He did not know one thing against him, but he felt the man was crooked, and he knew that Paul Revere and Joseph Warren felt as he felt about Church. Dr. Warren was in Roxbury tending a sick woman. His wife bade Johnny come back at 5. Johnny had saved Paul Revere for the last because he lived at North Square, and, being a Sunday, he knew that Cilla and Asana would be waiting for him by the town pump. Guiltily, he remembered he had not bothered to meet them last Thursday, nor the Sunday before, nor the Thursday before that. He glanced about. The girls were not there, and secretly he was relieved. He went on to Mr. Revere's. The silversmith was busy drawing a political cartoon concerning tea and tyranny. He did not draw well, not the way he made silver. As he drew, his children crowded about him, standing on the rungs of his chair, breathing down his neck, dropping crumbs of gingerbread into his hair. But Paul Revere took all this confusion as he took everything else, without any fussing. "I believe I owe you 8 shillings, he said, with a wide smile on his dark, ruddy face. The eyes gleamed. Now there was only Dr. Warren left. Then he'd go back and help Rab set out all those chairs in the attic, get ready for the meeting that night. But Cilla and Asana were standing by the pump. Cilla looked little, and forlorn. The delicate face was pale. Things were not going too well for the Laphams. Cilla was a little shabby. The sight of her touched Johnny's heart. He pitied her, and yet he wished she had not come. Now it seemed years ago, not months, that he lived at the Laphams, and then surely Cilla and Asana were the only friends he had. But he had, on going to the Observer, entered a new, vast, and exciting world. He had made new friends. He was absorbed in the excitement over the tea, over the secret meeting tonight. Of all of these things and people, Cilla knew nothing, nor could he tell her. Yet he tried to show interest in what she had to tell him. Once he would have been very interested. Now he felt like a hypocrite, and because he was uncomfortable, he blamed it in some way on Cilla. Had Mr. Tweedy decided whether he would marry Madge or Dorcas? Cilla hoped he would choose Madge. Dorcas was just about crazy over Fritzl Jr. She said she would elope with him if Ma tried to make her marry Tweedy. How was Dove? Just like always. Dusty? Hadn't he heard? Dusty had run away to sea. Old Master? No. He had not even stepped inside his shop since he had signed with Mr. Tweedy. He said he had it long to live, and he was going to spend all his time preparing to meet his maker. But Johnny wasn't really interested in all of this news. He was absorbed with the meeting this night, the tea ships. It bothered him a little that Cilla was so faithful. There had been many a Sunday when he did not get to North Square. He was too busy with Rab and his new world, but he knew that Cilla, usually as today, totting to Santa along with her, never failed. She said she understood he could not always keep his schedule, but if he tried harder, he could certainly have done a lot better. That very feminine faithfulness of the girl irritated him, but he had not admitted this to himself. She took it for granted that Johnny had not changed, and he had changed much. If the winter of '73 Johnny Tremain had a romantic attachment to anyone, it was to that black-haired and, as far as he knew, black-hearted, bad-tempered, disagreeable, conceivable cousin of his Miss Lavinia Lyte. Certainly not Priscilla Lapham. Cilla especially got on his nerves. She was showing off more and more all the time. She knew that if she kept her hood off, someone would come along and say how pretty she was. Even now, an elderly clergyman was approaching, opening his mouth. Johnny did not stop to hear. He left. Dr. Warren was back from Roxbury. He was sitting in his surgery, still in his riding boots and spurs. 8 shillings, sir, said Johnny. I guess we'd meet tonight. I'll be there, but wait a moment. I promised this article to Mr. Lorne this morning. Got held up. Woman fell out of an apple tree, broken thigh. He went on writing. He was a fine-looking young man, with fresh skin and thick blonde hair and very bright blue eyes. Even a horseboy merely entering that surgery would feel confidence in him and his skill. Johnny took off the red mittens Aunt Lauren had knit for him and stretched his hands toward the fire blazing on the hearth. The pen stopped, scratching. Dr. Warren had stopped writing, and although his back was to him, Johnny knew those clean, clear blue eyes were staring at him. They were staring at his crippled hand. Instantly, Johnny thrust it back into his breeches pocket. He straightened himself unconsciously, preparing to be either sullen or arrogant. My boy, came the doctor's gentle voice. Let me see your hand. Johnny did not face him. He said nothing. You don't want me to look at it? As long as it might take to count 10, there was complete silence. Then the boy said, No, sir, thank you. Was it God's will? Should it be so? Dr. Warren meant, was it crippled from birth? If so, it would be harder for him to help. Yes, said Johnny, thinking of how he had ruined it upon a Lord's Day. God's will be done, said the young doctor. He went back to his writing. Outside, Johnny could hear shouting, yelling, whistles, the running of feet. With the coming of night, the Sons of Liberty were abroad, tacking up Mr. Adams' placards. Tonight, Rab was not out with them, although he had been off once or twice of late, helping to frighten the tea consignees out of Boston to the protection of a handful of British soldiers stationed on Castle Island. Johnny was too young to be a son, but when the observers met, the boys always stayed in the room below to run errands for them, and it was always Rab who mixed the fragrant punch with which the meetings ended. All over Boston was a feeling of excitement. Everyone knew that the Dartmouth was about a few miles away. Great events were brewing. Johnny went to the door to see what the clamor was. A courageous Tory was chasing the men whom he had found tacking a placard on his property. They had let him chase them thus far to Dark Salt Lane, and now had turned on him. Such street brawling made Johnny feel sick. He closed the door, sat down beside Rab, and began slicing lemons, oranges, and limes. Rab? Yes? What will they decide, those men upstairs? You heard Sam Adams. If possible, the ships will sail home again with their tea. We've got 20 days. But if the governor won't agree, he won't. You don't know Hutchinson. I do. And you saw how happy Sam was this morning. He knows the governor a lot better than I do. And then? And what next, Rab? Johnny heard blows and oaths from the street outside. His hands shook. He put down the knife so Rab wouldn't know. They were doing something awful to the Tory. As soon as we go upstairs with our punch, we'll know. Look at Sam Adams. If he looks as pleased as an old dog fox with a fat pullet in his mouth, we'll know they've agreed to violence if everything else fails. He doesn't care much anymore about our patching up our differences with England. He just about welcome a war. But the king's warships are in the harbor. They'll protect the tea. They'll fight. We can fight too. Rab was putting the last delicate touches to his kettle full of brew, for tonight the punch wouldn't be hot. He was grating nutmegs cautiously, sprinkling in cloves, and breaking up cinnamon bark. Taste it, Johnny. That Madeira Mr. Hancock brought with his first class. But Johnny heard a low moaning in the street, close to the shut door. That Tory, who had been so brave and foolish as to follow the Sons of Liberty down a black alley, was alone now, was sobbing, not from pain, but from humiliation. Johnny decided to taste the punch. Mr. Lorne called down the ladder. Boys, ready with your punch? They made up their minds fast tonight, said Rab. I rather thought they would. Johnny carried a handful of pewter cups and the big wooden bowl. Rab followed with 2 pitchers of a spicy brew. The attic where the boys commonly slept looked strange enough with those chairs pulled out and arranged for the meeting. John Hancock sat in the moderator's chair. His face looked white and drawn. Probably his head still ached. Beside him was Sam Adams, leaning toward him, whispering and whispering. Johnny thought how the Tories were saying that Sam Adams seduced John Hancock, even as the devil had seduced Eve, by a constant whispering in his ear. Adams turned his face as Johnny sat down the wooden bowl on the baize-covered box before the moderator. Johnny had never seen an old dog fox with a fat pole in his mouth, but he recognized the expression when he saw it. Rab poured the punch, and instantly the tense silence was broken. The men were on their feet, crowding up about the bowl. Rab and Johnny were well known. Here was Paul Revere, clinking his cup with Rab, and John Hancock was telling Johnny how far too well his old slave woman guarded his privacy. Actually, 3 men had come to the house to tell him the first of the tea ships had been sighted, but he had not known anything was afoot until he got Johnny's bill on his tray. Then he guessed what had happened. Here's to December the 16th. Hear, hear. They drank to the last day, the day on which the tea must be destroyed, unless it was allowed to return to England. And Johnny saw that Sam Adams had carried them all with him. They did not honestly want the tea returned and a peaceful settlement made. They wanted grievances, and more grievances. Well, yes, armed warfare. Things were in such a state, they did not honestly believe there could be any permanent, friendly settlement with the mother country. Johnny looked about through the haze of tobacco smoke. There was Dr. Warren. He was talking with Uncle Lorne and John Adams about the article he had written for the newspaper. Suddenly, he lifted his head, smiled, almost laughed. Johnny did not know why Warren smiled. Why had Johnny been such a fool? Why couldn't he have shown his hand to the doctor? He bit into his lower lip. After his rudeness to Dr. Warren, he did not see how he could ever go to him and say, I've changed my mind. I want you to look at it. I think you are the only person in the world who can help me. So when Dr. Warren a little later looked toward Johnny, ready to smile, forgive his discourtesy, the boy looked away. He was so embarrassed, he was rude again. Sam Adams was standing at the far end of the room, and Mr. Hancock still sat, his head in his hands. Adams clapped slightly, and instantly conversation stopped. Gentlemen, he said, tonight we have made our decision, and know the method by which the detested tea can be destroyed if the ships are not allowed to return. Here we have with us 2 of exactly, the sort of boys or young men we intend to use for our great purpose. 2 boys in whom we have implicit trust. If it is the wish of the assembled club members, I suggest we approach them with our proposition tonight, and enlist their aid. 20 days will be up before we know. We best get on with our plans. The members once more took their seats, but the pewter cups of punch were passing from hand to hand. Only Will Molyneux was too restless to sit. He was muttering to himself. Ben Church sat alone. He often did. No one really liked him. All agreed the boys were to be told. First, Adam said to the boys, raise your right hands, swear by the great name of God himself, never, for as long as you live, to divulge to anyone the secret matters now trusted to you. Do you so swear? The boys swore. Hancock was not looking at them. He sat with his aching head in his hands. There's no chance, not one. Those ships will be allowed to return. The mass meetings which will be held almost daily, demanding the return of the tea, are to arouse public opinion and to persuade the world we did not turn to violence until every other course had been blocked to us. When the 20 days are up, on the night of the 16th of December, those ships are going to be boarded. That tea will be dumped into Boston Harbor. For each ship, the Dartmouth and the Eleanor, and the brig, the Beaver, we will need 30 stout, honest, fearless men and boys. Will you be one, Rab? He did not say Rab and Johnny, as the younger boy noticed. Was this because he thought Johnny too crippled-handled for chopping open sea chests, or merely because he knew Rab better and he was older? Of course, sir. How many other boys could you find for the night's work? Strong and trustworthy boys, for if 1 ounce of tea is stolen, the whole thing becomes a robbery, not a protest. Rab thought, 8 or 10 tonight, but give me a little time so I can feel about a bit and I can furnish 15 or 20. Boys, you keep their mouths shut. Yes. Paul Revere said, I can furnish 20 or more from about North Square. No one is to be told in advance just what the work will be, nor who the others are, nor the names of the men who instigated this tea party. That is, the gentlemen gathered here tonight, simply as they love their country and liberty and hate tyranny. They are to gather in this shop on the night of the December 16th, carrying with them such disguises as they can think of, and each armed with an axe or hatchet. It will be as you say. The discussion became more general. Each of these 3 groups must have a leader, men who could keep discipline. I'll go for one, said Paul Revere. Dr. Warren warned him. Look here, Paul. It has been decided this work must be done by apprentices, strangers, folk little known about Boston. The East Indian Company may bring suit if you are recognized. I'll risk it. Uncle Lorne was motioning to the boys to leave the conspirators. They did not want to leave, but they did. Both the boys were in their truckle beds. The loft still smelled of tobacco and the spices of the punch. Johnny moved restlessly on his bed. Rab? Rab, those boys you promised, am I one? Of course, but my hand. What will we have to do? Chop open tea chests, dump tea in the harbor. Rab? How can I ever chop? You have 20 days to practice it. Logs and backyard need splitting. Rab? But the older boy was asleep. Johnny was so wide awake he couldn't close his eyes. Old meeting struck midnight. He settled himself again. Surely if he tried hard enough, he could sleep. He was thinking of those tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver. Great white sails spread softly, sweeping on and on through the night to Boston. Nearer, nearer. He was almost asleep, twitched, and was wide awake. He would not think of the tea ships, but of those logs in the backyard he would practice on. He thought of Dr. Warren. Oh, why he had not let him see his hand. Cilla waiting and waiting for him at North Square, and then he got there only about when it pleased him. He loved Cilla. She and Rab were the best friends he had ever had. Why was he mean to her? He couldn't think. He would take an axe in his left hand and chop, 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 so he fell asleep. Something large and white was looming up over him, about to run him down. He struggled awake, sat up, and found he was sweating. It was the great sails of the tea ships. From the bed next to him, he heard the soft, slow breathing of the older boy, so much more involved than Johnny in the brewing storm. Rab had been able to drop off immediately. Somehow Johnny must draw into himself something of Rab's calm, his nerveless strength. He began to breathe in unison with the sleeping boy, so slowly, so softly. He fell into a heavy sleep. Next morning, Johnny was up and out in the backyard early. At first, it seemed impossible to hold an axe in his left hand, steady it with his bad right. He gritted his teeth and persevered. Rab said nothing of his struggles. He merely set type, pulled proofs as usual. But often he was gone from home, and Johnny knew he was feeling about for those 15 to 20 boys he had promised. Would the others go and Johnny be left behind? He could not bear the thought, and Rab had promised him that in 20 days he might learn to chop. Having finished the logs in Mr. Lorne's backyard, he began chopping free gratis for the Afric Queen. Almost every day, and sometimes all day, the mass meetings at Old South Church went on. Tempers grew higher and higher. Boston was swept with a passion it had not known since the Boston Massacre 3 years before. Riding this wild storm was Sam Adams and his trusty henchmen, directing it, building up the anger until, although the matter was not publicly mentioned, they would all see the only thing left for them to do was to destroy the tea. Sometimes Rab and Johnny went to these meetings. It happened they were there when the sheriff arrived and bade the meeting forthwith to disperse. He said it was lawless and treasonable. This proclamation from Governor Hutchinson was met with howls and hisses. They voted to disobey the order. Sometimes the boys slipped over to Griffin's Wharf. By the 8th of December, the Eleanor had joined the Dartmouth. These were strange ships. They had unloaded their cargoes, except the tea. The town of Boston had ordered them not to unload the tea, and the law stated they could not leave until they had unloaded. Nor would the governor give them a pass to return to England. At Castle Island, the British Colonel Leslie had orders to fire upon them if they attempted to sneak out of the harbor. The Active and the King's Fisher, British men of war, stood by ready to blast them out of the water if they obeyed the town and returned to London with their tea. The ships were held at Griffin's Wharf, as though under an enchantment. Here was none of the usual hustle and bustle. Few of the crew were in sight, but hundreds of spectators gathered every day merely to stare at them. Johnny saw Roach, the 23-year-old Quaker who owned the Dartmouth, running about in despair. The governor would not let him leave. The town would not let him unload. Between them, he was a ruined man. He feared a mob would burn his ship. There was no mob, and night and day armed citizens guarded the ships. They would see to it that no tea was smuggled ashore and that no harm was done to the ships. Back and forth paced the guard. Many of their faces were familiar to Johnny. One day, even John Hancock took his turn with a musket on his shoulder, and the next night he saw Paul Revere. Then on the 15th, a third of the tea ships arrived. This was the brig, the Beaver. The next day, the 16th, Johnny woke to hear the rain drumming sadly on the roof, and soon enough, once more, he heard all the bells of Boston clang-clanging, bidding the inhabitants come once more and for the last time to Old South to demand the peaceful return of the ships to England. By nightfall, when the boys Rab had selected began slightly to congregate in the office of the Observer, behind locked doors, the rain stopped. Many of them Johnny knew. When they started to assume their disguises, smooch their faces with soot, paint them with red paint, pull on nightcaps, old frocks, torn jackets, blankets with holes cut for their arms. They began giggling and laughing at each other. Rab could silence them with one look, however. No one passing outside the shop must guess that toward 20 boys were at that moment dressing themselves as Indians. Johnny had taken some pains with his costume. He had sewed for hours on red blanket Mrs. Lorne had let him cut up, and he had a fine mop of feathers standing upright and the old knitted cap he would wear on his head. But when he started to put on his disguise, Rab said, "No, wait a minute." Then he divided the boys into 3 groups. Beside each ship at the wharf they would find a band of men. "You," he said to one group of boys, "will join the boarding party for the Dartmouth. You for the Eleanor. You for the Beaver." Each boy was to speak softly to the leader and say, "Me know you," for that was the countersign. They would know the 3 leaders because each of them would wear a white handkerchief about the neck and a red string about the right wrist. Then he turned to Johnny. "You can run faster than any of us. Somehow get to Old South Church. Mr. Roach will be back from begging once more the governor's permission for the ships to sail within an hour. Half hour. Now, Johnny, you are to listen to what Sam Adams says next. Look you, if Mr. Adams then says, now may God help my country, come back here. Then we take off our disguises and each go home and say nothing. But if he says, this meeting can do nothing more to save the country, you are to get out of that crowd as fast as you can, and as soon as you get into Cornhill, begin to blow upon this silver whistle. Run as fast as you are able, back here to me, and keep on blowing. I'll have boys posted in dark corners, close enough to the church, but outside the crowd. Maybe we'll hear you the first time you blow." About Old Sal standing in the streets inside the church waiting for Roach to return with the very last appeal that could be made to the governor was the greatest crowd Boston had ever seen. Thousands upon thousands. There was not a chance, not one Johnny could ever squirm or wriggle his way inside. But he pushed and shoved until he stood close to one of the doors. Farther than this he could not go, unless he walked on people's heads. It was dark already. Josiah Quincy's voice rang out from within. "I see the clouds roll and the lightning play. To that God who rides the whirlwind and directs the storm, I commit my country." The words thrilled Johnny, but this was not what he was waiting for, and it was not Sam Adams speaking. He was bothered with only one thing. Quincy had a beautiful, caring voice. It was one thing to hear him, and another Sam Adams, who did not speak well at all. The crowd made way for a chase. Roach is back. Make way for Roach. Mr. Roach passed close to Johnny. He was so young he looked almost ready to cry. This was proof enough that the governor had still refused. Such a turmoil followed Roach's entry. Johnny could not hear any particular voice. What chance had he of hearing Sam Adams' words? He had his whistle in his hand, but he was so jammed into the crowd about the door that he did not believe he would be able to get his hand into his mouth. Silence! That was Quincy again. Silence! Silence! Mr. Adams will speak. Johnny twisted and turned and brought the whistle to his lips. And suddenly there was silence. Johnny guessed there were many in that crowd who, like himself, were hanging on those words. Seemingly, Mr. Adams was calmly accepting defeat, dismissing the meeting. For now he was saying, this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Johnny gave his first shrill blast on his whistle, and he heard whistles and cries seemingly in all directions, Indian war whoops, and Boston Harbor teapot tonight. Hooray for Griffin's Wharf. Saltwater tea. Hi, Mohawks, get your axes and pay no taxes. Johnny was only afraid all would be over before Rab and his henchmen could get to the wharf. Still shrilling on the whistle, he fought and floundered against the tide of the crowd. It was sweeping toward Griffin's Wharf. He struggled to get back to Salt Lane. Now he was afraid the others would have gone on without him. After all, Rab might have decided that Johnny's legs and ears were better than his hands, and deliberately let him do the work that best suited him. Johnny pushed open the door. Rab was alone. He had Johnny's blanket coat, his ridiculous bee-feathered knitted cap in his hands. Quick, he said, and smooshed his face with soot, drew a red line across his mouth, running from ear to ear. Johnny saw Rab's eyes through the mask of soot. They were glowing with that dark excitement he had seen but twice before. His lips were parted. His teeth looked sharp and white as an animal's. In spite of his calm demeanor, calm voice, he was charged and surcharged with a will to action, a readiness to take and enjoy any desperate chance. Rab had come terrifyingly alive. They flung themselves out of the shop. Round about, cried Rab. He meant they would get to the wharf by back alleys. Come, follow me. Now we're really going to run. He flew up Salt Lane in the opposite direction from the waterfront. Now they were flinging themselves down back alleys, faster and faster. Once they had a glimpse of the blacksmith shop and other Indians clamoring for soot for their faces. Now slipping over a backyard fence, now at last on the waterfront, C Street, Flounder Alley. They were running so fast it seemed more like a dream of flying than reality. The day had started with rain, and then there had been clouds. But as they reached Griffin's Wharf, the moon, full and white, broke free of the clouds. The three ships, the silent hundreds gathering upon the wharf, all were dripped in the pure white light. The crowds were becoming thousands, and there was not one there but guessed what was to be done, and all approved. Rab was grunting out of the side of his mouth to a thick-set, active-looking man whom Johnny would have known anywhere, but his walk and the confident lift of his head was Mr. Revere. Me know you. Me know you, Johnny repeated this countersign and took his place behind Mr. Revere. The other boys, held up by the crowd, began arriving, and more men and boys. But Johnny guessed that many who were now quietly joining one of those three groups were acting on the spur of the moment. Seeing what was up, they had blackened their faces, seized axes, and come along. They were behaving as quietly and were so as obedient to their leaders as those who had been so carefully picked for this work of destruction. There was a boatswain whistle, and in silence one group boarded the Dartmouth. The Eleanor and the Beaver had to be warped into the wharf. Johnny was close to Mr. Revere's heels. He heard him calling for the captain, promising him in the jargon everyone talked that night, that not one thing should be damaged on the ship except only the tea. But the captain and all his crew had best stay in the cabin until the work was over. Captain Hall shrugged and did as he was told, leaving his cabin boy to hand over the keys to the hold. The boy was grinning with pleasure. The tea party was not unexpected. I'll show you, the boy volunteered, how to work them hoists. I'll fetch lanterns, mister. The winches rattled and the heavy chests began to appear, 150 of them. As some men worked in the hold, others broke open. The chests had flung the tea into the harbor, but one thing made them an unexpected difficulty. The tea inside the chest was wrapped in heavy canvas. The axes went through the wood easily enough. The canvas made endless trouble. Johnny had never worked so hard in his life. He had noticed a stout boy with a blackened face working near him. The boy looked familiar, but when he saw his white, fat hands, Johnny knew who he was and kept a sharp eye on him. It was Dove. He was not one of the original Indians, but a volunteer. He had an enormous pair of breeches tied at each knee with rope. Even as Johnny opened a chest and helped get the tea over the rail, he kept an eye on Dove. The boy was secretly scooping tea into his breeches. This theft would come to several $100s in value, but more important, it would ruin the high morale tone of the party. Johnny whispered to Rab, who put down the axe he had been wielding with such passion, and grabbed Dove. It wasn't much of a scuffle. Soon Dove was whining and admitting that a little of the tea had happened to splash into his breeches. Johnny got them off and kicked them and the many pounds of tea they held into the harbor. "He swim good," he grunted at Rab, for everyone was talking Indian that night. Rab picked up the fat Dove as though he were a rag baby and flung him into the harbor. The tea was thicker than any seaweed, and its fragrance was everywhere. Not a quarter mile, quite visible in the moonlight, rode the Active and the Kingfisher. Any moment the tea party might be interrupted by British Marines. There was no landing party. Governor Hutchinson had been wise in not sending for their help. The work of the Dartmouth and the Eleanor finished about the same time. The Beaver took longer, for she had not had time to unload the rest of the cargo, and great care was taken not to injure it. Just as Johnny was about to go over to see if he could help on the Beaver, Miss Revere whispered to him, "Go get brooms. Clean deck." Johnny and a parcel of boys brushed the deck until it was clean as a parlor floor. Then Mr. Revere called the captain to come up and inspect. The tea was utterly gone, but the Captain Hall agreed that beyond that there had not been the slightest damage. It was close upon dawn when the work on all three ships was done, and yet the great silent audience of the wharf, men, women, and children, had not gone home. As the three groups came off the ships, they formed in fours along the wharf, their axes on their shoulders. Then a hurrah went up, and a fife began to play. This was almost the first sound Johnny had heard since the tea party started, except only the crash of axes into sea chests, the squeak of hoists, and a few grunted orders. Standing quietly in the crowd, he saw Sam Adams pretending to be a most innocent bystander. It looked to Johnny as if the dog Fox had eaten a couple fat pullets and had a third in his mouth. As they started marching back to the center of town, they passed the coffin house at the head of Griffin's Wharf. A window opened. "Well, boys," said a voice, so cold one hardly knew whether he spoke in anger or not, "you've had a fine, pleasant evening for your Indian caper, haven't you? But mind, you've got to pay the fiddler yet." It was the British Admiral Montague. "Come on down here," someone yelled, "and we'll settle that score tonight." The Admiral pulled in his head and slapped down the window. Johnny and Rab knew, and men like the observers knew, but best of all, Sam Adams knew, that the fiddler would have to be paid. England, unable to find the individuals who had destroyed this valuable property, would punish the whole town of Boston, make every man, woman, and child, Tories and Whigs alike, suffer until this tea was paid for. Nor was she likely to back down on her claim that she might tax the colonists any way she pleased. Next day, all over Boston, boys and men, some of them with a little paint still showing behind their ears, were so lame they could scarce move their fingers, but none of them, not one, told what it was that had lamed them so. They would stand about and wonder who those Mohawks might have been, or what the British Parliament might do next, but never say what they themselves had been doing, for each was sworn to secrecy. Only Paul Revere showed no signs of the hard physical strain he had been under all the night before. Not long after dawn, he had started on horseback for New York and Philadelphia with an account of the tea party. He could chop open tea chests all night and ride all day.